In the grand, sweeping story of the American Civil War, we often think we know the main characters. We see Lincoln and Davis, Grant and Lee. We picture the blue and the gray, armies clashing on fields with names now etched into the national memory: Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh. It is a story of a nation torn in two, of brother against brother, a story defined by clear lines on a map. But beneath this familiar history, beneath the tramp of marching armies and the roar of cannons, lies another story, a shadow story. It's a tale of secret societies, of whispered oaths in torchlit halls, of a hidden empire built on a dream of gold and human bondage. This is the story of an organization that aimed not just to preserve the South, but to create a vast tropical slave empire that would dominate the world. This is the history of the Knights of the Golden Circle. To understand the Knights, you first have to understand the America that gave birth to them. The 1850s were a decade of simmering rage. The nation was not just divided, it was coming apart at the seams. Every new territory acquired, every new state admitted to the Union, became a battleground over a single explosive question. Would it be free soil, or would it be slave soil? The South, once the dominant political and economic force in the nation, felt itself increasingly cornered. Abolitionist voices in the North were growing louder, more insistent. Southern leaders saw a future where they would be a permanent minority in Congress, where their entire way of life, built on the institution of slavery, would be slowly strangled into extinction. They felt a demographic and political noose tightening around their necks. In this atmosphere of fear and fervor, a man named George W.L. Bickley stepped onto the stage. Bickley was not a great statesman or a brilliant general. He was a product of his time, a restless, ambitious, and deeply flawed visionary. A doctor by trade, a writer by aspiration, and a professional schemer by nature. He moved from town to town, from venture to venture, always chasing a grand idea that was just beyond his grasp. He was in many ways the perfect vessel for a radical, intoxicating dream. In Cincinnati, Ohio, of all places, a northern city on the very border of the slave state of Kentucky, Bickley gathered a handful of men of like-minded in 1854 and founded his secret society. He called it the Knights of the Golden Circle. The name itself was a declaration of intent. It was geographic. It was imperial. Bickley and his followers envisioned a new nation, a new destiny for the South. They took out a map and drew a circle, a perfect golden circle, with its center in Havana, Cuba. The circle had a radius of 1,200 miles, stretching north to encompass the southern states of America, and south to swallow everything in its path. It would annex all of Mexico, all of Central America, the islands of the Caribbean, and parts of what is now Colombia and Venezuela. This was not merely about secession, this was about conquest. The purpose of this vast new empire was singular and unapologetic: to be the world's greatest and most powerful slave-holding nation. The lands within the Golden Circle were the richest agricultural territories on the planet, perfectly suited for the cash crops that fueled the 19th century global economy: cotton, sugar, tobacco, coffee, and rice. By controlling this territory, the empire of the Golden Circle would hold a monopoly on these vital resources. It would become so economically powerful that the industrial North, and indeed the empires of Europe, would be forced to bend to its will. Slavery would not just be preserved, it would be expanded, entrenched, and made permanent, the unquestionable cornerstone of a new world power. Bickley's organization was built on the model of the popular fraternal orders of the day, like the Freemasons and the Oddfellows, but with a militant political core. It was shrouded in secrecy and ritual. Members, who were exclusively white men of Southern sympathy, would progress through different degrees of initiation. There was an outer guard, the so-called military degree, composed of the foot soldiers who would fight for the cause. Then there was an inner circle, the financial degree, composed of wealthy planters and merchants who would fund the enterprise. And at the very center, the American Legion, a secretive governing body that directed the entire operation. They had secret handshakes, passwords, and coded language. Local chapters were called castles, and they began to spring up across the South and in the sympathetic border states. In its early years, before the storm of the Civil War broke, the KGC's primary focus was on what was then known as filibustering. This wasn't about long speeches in a legislature. In the 19th century, a filibuster was a private military adventurer who invaded a foreign country to foment revolution or claim territory. The most famous was William Walker, the gray-eyed man of destiny, who briefly made himself president of Nicaragua. The Knights of the Golden Circle aimed to do the same, but on a much grander scale. Their first target was Mexico. Mexico in the 1850s was politically unstable, racked by internal conflicts. The Knights saw it as ripe for the taking. Bickley drew up elaborate plans for an invasion. He promised his followers land, riches, and glory. He printed pamphlets and went on speaking tours, trying to recruit an army of thousands. He envisioned a swift conquest, after which Mexico would be carved up into 25 new slave states, a massive expansion of their empire's foundation. These plans were not just idle talk. The Knights actively tried to raise men and money. They sought to purchase weapons and ships. They corresponded with sympathetic figures within Mexico. They saw themselves as the vanguard of manifest destiny, a southern version of it, carrying the banner of slavery south instead of west. But Bickley's grand Mexican adventure was a failure. He was a better talker than an organizer. The expeditions were poorly planned and chronically underfunded. The American government, while often turning a blind eye to filibustering, saw Bickley's plans as too ambitious and too destabilizing and worked to thwart them. The Mexican government was aware of the threat and prepared its defenses. The Knights never managed to launch their grand invasion. Their dream of a southern conquest fizzled out in a haze of broken promises and empty coffers. This failure, however, did not kill the organization. It merely forced it to change its focus. If they could not expand southward first, they would have to secure their home base. The simmering conflict within the United States was about to boil over, and the Knights of the Golden Circle would be ready to play their part. When the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 signaled the breaking point for the South, the KGC found its true calling. The castles that had been established throughout the southern states became hotbeds of secessionist fervor. The Knights were no longer just dreaming of Mexico. They were actively working to dissolve the United States. They organized militias, intimidated Union supporters, and provided the secret organizational muscle for the secession movement. They were the true believers, the radical core who had been advocating for a break with the North for years. When states like South Carolina, Mississippi, and Texas voted to secede, the Knights of the Golden Circle were in the halls, in the streets, and in the militias, pushing the agenda forward. Their dream of a slave empire seemed closer than ever. Now it would be born not from a foreign invasion, but from a domestic revolution. As the Confederate States of America was formed and the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the role of the KGC in the South became intertwined with the Confederate cause itself. Many of its members joined the Confederate Army, rising to positions of command. But the organization's most infamous and arguably most significant role during the Civil War would be played not on the battlefields of Virginia or Tennessee, but in the heart of the enemy's territory, the North. While the nation was dividing along the Mason-Dixon line, the North was not a monolithic block of Unionist sentiment. In the states of the lower Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and in the border states that remained in the Union, like Kentucky and Missouri, there was a powerful anti-war movement. This region was populated by many families with Southern roots and strong cultural and economic ties to the South. They were largely Democrats who despised Lincoln, resented the powerful industrialists of New England, and fiercely opposed the abolition of slavery. They became known as Copperheads, after the venomous snake that strikes without warning, and the Knights of the Golden Circle became their secret, militant wing. The castles of the KGC in the north operated as a fifth column, a network of spies and saboteurs dedicated to undermining the Union war effort from within. Their activities were widespread and insidious. They encouraged Union soldiers to desert and provided them with safe houses and civilian clothes. They organized armed resistance to the military draft, sometimes firing on federal enrollment officers. They smuggled medicine and supplies across the river to the Confederacy. They stockpiled weapons in secret caches, preparing for a potential popular uprising. They circulated viciously anti-Lincoln and anti-war propaganda, feeding a narrative that the conflict was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, an unconstitutional crusade to free the slaves at the expense of white working men. The federal government was keenly aware of this threat. Governor Oliver Morton of Indiana, a staunch Republican, was convinced that the KGC was plotting to overthrow the state government and take Indiana out of the war, perhaps even joining the Confederacy. He employed spies and informants to infiltrate the organization, leading to a shadowy intelligence war fought not in the open, but in the lodges, farmhouses, and back alleys of the Midwest. One of the Union's most famous detectives, Allan Pinkerton, assigned agents to join the KGC and report on their activities. What they found was a sprawling network, with estimates of membership ranging from a few tens of thousands to an almost unbelievable figure of over 250,000. The secrecy of the Knights makes it impossible to know their true strength, but the fear they inspired was very real. In 1863, the organization was so emboldened that it restructured itself, changing its name to the Order of American Knights and later the Sons of Liberty, with the prominent Copperhead politician Clement Vallandigham of Ohio as its supreme commander. Their plans grew more ambitious, more daring. They hatched a plot known as the Northwest Conspiracy. The plan was to use thousands of armed members to converge on military prisons in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. They would overwhelm the guards, free the thousands of Confederate prisoners of war held there, arm them, and unleash this new army on the northern home front. They would burn cities, disrupt supply lines, and spark a general uprising that would force Lincoln to sue for peace. It was a dramatic, almost cinematic plot, and it came terrifyingly close to happening. The date was set, the conspirators were in place, but at the last minute, Union intelligence, aided by informants within the order, got wind of the full scope of the plot. Federal troops moved in, arresting the ringleaders, including a prominent Indiana lawyer named Lambden P. Milligan. They seized caches of weapons and incriminating documents. The Northwest Conspiracy collapsed before it could begin, but the subsequent treason trials revealed the depth and seriousness of the threat. The Knights were not just a debating society, they were armed and organized revolutionaries operating in the Union's own backyard. The trial of Lambden Milligan became a landmark case. He and his fellow conspirators were tried by a military tribunal and sentenced to hang. Their case eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court, which, after the war, ruled that civilians could not be tried by military courts in areas where civilian courts were still functioning. The decision, Ex parte Milligan, is a cornerstone of American civil liberties today, a legal precedent born directly from the secret war against the Knights of the Golden Circle. As the Union armies under Grant and Sherman ground the Confederacy into submission in 1864 and 1865, the power of the Knights and the Copperhead movement began to fade. The victories on the battlefield discredited their anti-war message. The constant pressure from federal authorities broke up their networks. With Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April 1865, the cause for which the Knights had fought was lost. Their dream of a golden circle, a continental slave empire, was dead. The organization, with its purpose gone, officially dissolved and vanished back into the shadows from which it had come. But here, the story of the Knights of the Golden Circle splits in two. There is the history, and then there is the legend. The historical organization was defeated, but the legend was just beginning. And the most powerful, most enduring part of that legend is the story of a lost treasure. The tale goes like this. As the Confederacy collapsed, the Knights of the Golden Circle, who had amassed a vast war chest of gold and silver through donations from wealthy sympathizers and raids on Union supply trains, knew they could not let this fortune fall into federal hands. This treasure was meant to be the seed money for a second Civil War, a future uprising to restore the Southern cause. And so, under the cover of secrecy, operatives of the KGC took this immense treasure and buried it, not in one place, but in dozens, perhaps hundreds of secret caches scattered across the American South and Southwest. They hid it in caves in Arkansas, buried it beneath stone markers in Texas, and sunk it in the swamps of Louisiana. They created coded maps and secret symbols, clues to be passed down through generations until the time was right to reclaim the gold and restart the fight. This legend of KGC treasure has become one of the great, enduring myths of American folklore. It has captivated treasure hunters for over 150 years. It has fueled a cottage industry of books, websites, and television shows. People have dedicated their lives and spent their fortunes chasing these elusive clues. The story often intertwines with other famous figures of the era. Some legends claim that the famous outlaw Jesse James was not just a former Confederate guerrilla, but a high-ranking knight, and that his legendary train and bank robberies were not for personal gain, but were acts to rebuild the KGC's lost treasury. It's a romantic, compelling idea, the noble outlaw still fighting the war in secret. Countless expeditions have been launched. Sophisticated metal detectors have swept over thousands of acres. Caves have been explored, old maps have been scrutinized, and family stories have been passed down. But has any of this legendary treasure ever been found? There have been small discoveries, old coins and weapons found here and there that have been attributed to the Knights, but no vast, confirmed KGC treasure has ever been unearthed. Skeptics argue that the treasure likely never existed, at least not on the grand scale of the legends. It was, they say, a myth created after the war to keep hope alive, a bit of psychological comfort for a defeated people. But for believers, the lack of discovery only proves how well the treasure was hidden. The secret, they insist, is still out there, waiting for the right person to solve the puzzle. Beyond the treasure, the shadow of the Knights of the Golden Circle extends to the most traumatic event of the era, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. While the official history names John Wilkes Booth as the leader of a small band of conspirators, many have long suspected a deeper, wider plot. The KGC, with its history of clandestine operations, its network of spies, and its profound hatred for Lincoln, is the most obvious candidate for that larger conspiracy. Booth was known to have associated with Confederate Secret Service agents and men who were likely members of the Knights. Was his assassination plot the last, desperate act of the Sons of Liberty? A final vengeful blow from the shadow warriors of the Confederacy? The historical evidence for a direct link is tantalizing, but inconclusive. There is no definitive proof that Booth was an initiated member or that the KGC as an organization ordered the assassination, but the circumstantial connections are there. The assassination plot was complex, originally intended to be a kidnapping, reflecting the kind of ambitious, coordinated action the Knights specialized in. Whether officially sanctioned or not, Booth was acting on an ideology that the KGC had fostered and promoted for over a decade. He was the violent embodiment of their cause. In the minds of many, the ghost of the Knights of the Golden Circle will forever be present in the private box at Ford's Theater on that fateful night in April 1865. The legacy of the Knights, however, is not confined to folklore and conspiracy theories. The ideology that drove them did not simply vanish. The dream of the Golden Circle may have died, but its core principle, the unwavering commitment to white supremacy, survived and mutated. In the immediate aftermath of the war, as the South chafed under Reconstruction, new secret societies rose from the ashes of the old. The most infamous of these was the Ku Klux Klan. While a distinct organization, the first Klan borrowed heavily from the playbook of the Knights of the Golden Circle. It used secret rituals, passwords, and a hierarchical structure to intimidate and terrorize newly freed African Americans and their white Republican allies. It was, in essence, a continuation of the war by other, more terroristic means. The Klan sought to achieve what the Confederacy and the KGC had failed to do, to ensure the permanent subjugation of one race to another. The story of the Knights of the Golden Circle is a stark reminder that history is not always what it seems. Beneath the surface of the great, well-documented events, there are always currents of secret movements, radical ambitions, and hidden agendas. The KGC represented the most extreme and expansionist vision of the slave-holding South. They were not simply conservatives seeking to preserve a way of life. They were imperialists, dreaming of a continental empire built on a foundation of human misery. They planned to conquer nations and enslave millions more in the name of their cause. They were a real and present danger to the United States. Their network in the North posed a genuine threat to the Union war effort, forcing the Lincoln administration to fight a two-front war, one against the Confederate armies in the South and another against the secret armies of spies and saboteurs at home. They were traitors in the truest sense of the word, working from within to destroy their own country. And yet their story has been largely relegated to the footnotes of history, overshadowed by the epic battles and famous generals. Why? Perhaps because their story is uncomfortable. It complicates the neat narrative of a war between two clearly defined sides. It reveals a deep vein of anti-democratic white supremacist ideology that was not just confined to the Confederacy, but had powerful footholds throughout the nation. It shows us an America that was not only at war with itself, but also with a shadowy internal conspiracy that sought to remake the continent in its own dark image. Today, the Knights of the Golden Circle exist primarily as a legend. They are a story whispered among treasure hunters, a topic of fascination for conspiracy theorists, a ghost from a violent past. But their history is a vital and cautionary tale. It shows how quickly a political ideology can curdle into a secret, militant crusade. It reminds us that behind grand political movements, there are often hidden networks with far more radical goals. And it serves as a powerful illustration of the intoxicating allure of a lost cause, an allure that can transform history into myth, and myth into an obsession that lasts for centuries. The gold of the Knights may or may not be real, but the true legacy they left behind, a legacy of division, secrecy, and ideological extremism, is a treasure of a different sort, a dark inheritance that remains buried just beneath the surface of the American story.